Hey, this is Andy Powell of Wishbone Ash, and you're listening to the Total Kit Car on YouTube.
Hi, welcome to another episode of the Total Kit Car History File series. My name's Steve Hull, editor of TKC Mag and totalkitcar.com. Hope you're doing very well. Recording this on the 9th of December in 2025. Horrible, cold, dark, damp, wet day outside, so I thought I'd just cheer myself up a bit, talking about a much missed and genuine legend, a word that's often bandied about, I think, a bit too freely. But in the case of the great Frank Costin, fully deserved and earned. I had the privilege of knowing Frank, and what an amazing man. Amazing man to be in the presence of, actually. But anyway, today we're not going to just talk about Frank's career in general, although that one would be a three-parter. And it would be very good to do, actually. But no, this one we're going to focus in, just going to channel right in on a little thing towards the end of his career called the TMC Costin. A lovely Lotus 7-inspired car that, well, we'll come to that, we'll deal with it. But housekeeping first. 33% of viewers of this channel don't subscribe. So please, 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 it doesn't cost you a penny. Just press the subscribe button and also the like, because that really helps the algorithm. If you hit that like button, it'll present itself in the feeds of more people who may well genuinely be interested in the subject matter. And anyway, that's enough of that nonsense. Frank really was an automotive legend, as I said, and also design and aerodynamics. I mean, he had his set ways. He was very set in his ways, and he believed what he believed. And he'd argue till he was blue in the face, and if he disagreed. But he wouldn't be dismissive. He would listen to people, but he would then give his very considered point of view. Big fan of a wooden monocoque, of course. And also did a feature in the magazine, gosh, about 5 years ago, which I believe still to be the most definitive feature ever done on Frank's career. One of the features that I am most proud of in all my career, actually. And I've had some peers of mine tell me it was a good effort, which that's good enough for me, really. It's all I can ever ask for. But I described him in that feature as the man who tamed the wind, and I do believe that to be true. He was a king of aerodynamics. By the late 80s, he'd become slightly disillusioned with the automotive and motorsport industries. And he moved off to County Cork in Ireland. While he was there, he became involved in several projects, as he was his wont, inevitably, and it included designing and building his own house on the coast, on the west coast of Ireland. I saw it described once as an aerodynamic house. I don't know about that. I'm not sure. Probably no, Frank. It might have had spoilers and goodness knows what else on it, and little knacker ducks and things like that. But who knows? But anyway, he did that, built his own house. He was lecturing in design and aerodynamics at various colleges in Ireland. I think in the west side of Ireland. While he was very popular with the Irish government of the day, who really liked his ideas on the training of young engineers and apprentices, I should say. So much so that they actually suggested an initiative that Frank would be involved with and oversee that would see them sponsor a 20-week course for 10 university students, which would see them spend 6 weeks with Frank, then another 10 weeks on hands-on secondment with various companies in various industries, before finishing with 4 weeks at Frank's place. And Frank was very proud of that one. Another little-known Frank project while he was in Ireland was a light aircraft, a timber biplane that he was intending to offer in kit form. Unfortunately, promised funding for the project didn't materialise. As well as all the legendary and iconic products, vehicles and things that Frank designed in his long career, there was also an awful lot that should have done better, for want of bad luck, really. and that was one of them, I think. Anyway, he was also, at one time or another, while in Ireland, he was working for a company called Timony Research and Technology in a place called Gibbstown, which I think might be a suburb of Navan in County Meath. The company was a leading light involved in heavy and specialised vehicles. And I think in reality that meant they were involved in design, prototyping, manufacturing of a range of propelled vehicles involved in defence, fire and construction. And certainly Frank was, at that time, he was design chief for their military trucks, something wrong with my teeth today, military trucks and airport fire tenders division. Also employed at the time just happened to be a draftsman called Peter Thompson, along with two of his five brothers, but we'll come to that later on. But Val was chief financial officer and Sean was a design technician. And that would be very, well, coincidental in Frank's, the next stage of his career, really. Although he never set out really, and he never had designed a Lotus 7 inspired sports car, he was a fan very much, because let's not forget, back in the mid-50s, Frank was heavily involved with a Young Lotus company. But just before he moved to Ireland, I think I know why he moved to Ireland, but again, I'm not 110% sure, and I'm not going to sort of suggest something that might not be true. I think he was frustrated with a project that he believed in, that for whatever reason didn't materialise or proceed how he'd wanted it to proceed. But anyway, before he'd moved to Ireland, as I said, he designed a vehicle that he called Rushabout, or he codenamed Rushabout. He'd been working at the same time on evolving his beloved timber monocoque into a steel space frame. First on the Costin Amigo, of course, which was a fabulous car. Google that. But he wanted this car or the evolution of it, to be a 7 lookalike, shall we say, while pushing that design onwards and upwards, or the concept of the design. An American chap, an acquaintance of Frank's, had expressed an interest in importing those, or any resulting car, or anything that the Rushabout became, to the USA. But I'm not sure if he had the finance lined up, or Frank had some finance lined up, but whatever it was, the financing fell through. Familiar story, I'm afraid, and nothing came of that idea. So Frank had that one in his briefcase, I guess waiting for the right time, really. It is amazing. I should go back to that, really. So many very well-known projects on Frank's CV, starting with the Lotus Mark 8, but there are so many others that deserved equal acknowledgement and success, but for whatever reason, usually lack of finance, didn't make it. Anyway, while he was in Ireland, he kept as I say, the Rushabout design nicely locked away in his briefcase. And at some time, I never did find out how it came about, but for some time he discussed the idea with the Thompsons, particularly Peter, and expressed an interest in that car. And it really was no idle talk, as they discussed plans for setting up a company, which in short order became the Thompson Manufacturing Company in County Wexford, Castle Bridge, I think. With Thompsons led by Peter really loving and getting behind and becoming very enthusiastic about the idea of building their own sports car. And they set Frank up in one of their family, it's a big family farming family. And they set Frank up in one of the barns. I think they had lots of outbuildings, where he was charged with developing and building a prototype, which by the time it reached physical being was known as the TMC Costin. And TMC standing for Thompson Manufacturing Company. A lot of people suggested it was Thompson Motorsport Car. That's not true. Not a Thompson Motor Company. That's not true. It was Thompson Manufacturing Company. And from that prototype, he would develop all the jigs and the moulds ready for series production. The Thompsons agreed to pay him a fee for building the prototype and the work involved, and that entailed within that. And then he would receive 10% royalty for each sale thereafter of a production TMC Costin. By that time, another Thompson brother would join. Another Thompson brother came along and joined TMC, Anthony, and Peter had managed to arrange a grant from the Irish government's Industrial Development Authority, which I think came under their small industry scheme, and that allowed the Thompsons to build a 4,000 square foot factory in Castlebridge. I think it opened in July 1983. The funding also allowed them to employ some staff, 8 I believe, and by this stage it said that the Thompsons' enthusiasm was palpable. The car itself was underpinned by a very rigid space frame chassis, and Frank had deliberately incorporated a very large boot into his latest design. And he wanted it to be a proper touring car and be able to carry full-size luggage rather than squashy holdalls, which he detested. He also wanted it to be affordable to build. It was available in kit form as well as turnkey, but he wanted the parts to be readily available. He didn't want people having to scratch make stuff or have to go seeking expensive aftermarket parts. I guess commissioning Pilkington to develop the windscreen, which was bespoke to the car, was quite an expense. But as Pilkington always say, once it's done, once you've got that former, it's there for thereafter. It's like a book on a library shelf. It's there forever ever after, and you can pull copies out of it as required. Frank wanted a Targa style roof hood system. He didn't want the basic Lotus 7 type weather gear. He wanted typically something a little bit more elaborate and stylish for that. So we came up with like a Targa style roof with, I guess I hate using this term, but I think the only way to describe it is little doorlets, which sort of opened up and moved forward as they did open up. Given Frank's race background, although in his heart he was still an aircraft man, let's never forget. I mean, he was always described himself as an aircraft man. He wanted a road car, but he wanted one that would equally, or be at home just as equally or just as happily be at home on track. And these, of course, were the days before track days really caught on. So he wanted the car to have typical Frank, lots of adjustability. He wanted, as I said, to use affordable parts. Initially, I think he was in that great big bin marked Chevette, Vauxhall Chevette, and he used the 1256cc engine. He used that for the prototype. I think the first demonstrator, and it was available as an option as well as the entry-level TMC Costin. And as such, that would use the gearbox, steering components, and the cooling system. Meanwhile, the body was made usual sort of Caterham 7 type fare, I suppose, aluminium sheet with GRP used for wings and nose cone. Even though that engine only produced 52 bhp, the car weighed just 646 dripping wet, so it was good enough for sort of 90 miles an hour. It was no tarmac shredder, but it was what it was, and it was a Costin designed Lotus 7 type car that by all accounts handled beautifully, but we'll come on to why that was in a minute, really. And as ever, Frank's real interest, his area of interest, was under the skin. He was always more concerned with how a car handled rather than how it looked. And he would argue until he was blue in the face that the most important thing was how the car behaved on road or track than how it looked. He didn't want the aesthetics just for the sake of them. Did cost him, I think, at times. But that was his belief, and that's what he stuck by. I actually think, I mean, a lot of people criticised how the TMC Costin looked. I think it's an attractive looking thing. But going back to under the skin, it's the suspension setup that was pretty remarkable. For a start, there was that chassis was very sort of sturdy, but there were three distinct parts to it. There was front and rear sections and a centre. I hesitate using the word tub because it wasn't a GRP monocoque, of course, but there was a centre section that would be the cell for the occupants protection. But the front suspension was via double unequal length wishbones with coney dampers and full adjustment available for ride height. There were rod end bearings and rose joints throughout the car, which allowed for caster and camber adjustment. And I think it also had an anti-roll bar up at the front as well. If the front end was trick, the rear was quite remarkable. Although it only employed a live rear axle from the Chevette, I think the later cars that weren't based on Chevette, or the options that weren't based on Chevette, were, I think he used a Capri. I think it's the Atlas angled axle that was used on the Capri. But anyway, it was from a full Capri. And it was located on the initial ones were located via 4 trailing arms. That's 2 per side. And a panhard rod. Frank loved that setup because he said it promoted progressive understeer rather than potentially disastrous oversteer that could catch out the unwary. And I think there's a lot of logic there in that. At the rear as well, there was like the front, there were coney dampers, but this was an expensive element of the car. These were bespoke to it and described as frighteningly expensive in dispatches I've seen. But Frank liked them because they were self-leveling under load. Brakes discs at the front with drums at the back. Frank, having always been very close to motorsport, although he's an aircraft man, reckoned there was serious potential for the TMC Costin as a race car, or track car at the very least. And the Thompsons agreed, and they tasked Frank with building one. I think they were very excited about building and marketing a race car that was built in Ireland, as why wouldn't they be? And Frank drafted in, at the behest of Peter Thompson, a couple of brothers, Stephen and Paul Crabb, and that enabled him to crack on with that at a faster pace. This one, I think, had a hard top eraser and a full roll cage. A roll cage, I think I said. I didn't say rolled cage, did I? Roll cage, and as well as having one of George Robinson's vegan tune VTA twin cam engines, which in that guise produced about 158 bhp, I think. TMC Costin was officially launched in November 1983 at Mondello Park Race Circuit in. Now, I've been to Ireland loads of times, and I know that NAAS isn't pronounced NAS, it's Naas, I believe, in County Kildare, quite near the Curragh Racecourse, if I remember my tours around Ireland. Nice part of the world. Interested parties, dignitaries, and of course journalists from Ireland and the UK all made the trip and eagerly came along to see what was going on. And they liked what they saw. The cars were incredibly well received, and nice things were written about them in the motoring press. Although TMC weren't ready to start supplying cars, which may have cost them. It may not have done. I guess if they could have supplied cars within a few weeks of that launch, but they weren't ready until I think mid part of 1984, perhaps. I think they hadn't actually settled on final engine specs for the rest of the range, and I think they could also be. I guess there was, in the end, they went from sort of famine to feast, really, because they had. I don't know if it could be said they had too many variants and too many options, but I think it definitely caused confusion. They had issues with pricing as well, and again that might have done for them. But one of the early intentions of the Thompsons was to attract an Irish domestic customers to the car, because, as I said, they really were very proud to be building a car made in Ireland. Northern Ireland had the DeLorean around that time as well, of course, but this was the Republic of Ireland, and they wanted Irish customers to enjoy an Irish-built car. But as it turned out, and because of the pricing issues, that didn't, and the stringent, the brutal tax was placed on the things in Ireland. But So turnkeys and kit form were available. 3 variants for the road car were available from the outset, and I think they differed in trim versions or trim specification, if not engines, because I think they were separate. But you could order a GTA, a GTB, and a GTC. Engine choices were that good old Chevette we talked about, full crossflow or full CVH, with strengths of engine from that 52 bhp of the Chevette to the 160 bhp of the racer. Interestingly, Frank designed that chassis, he thought, to be able to cope with up to 300 bhp because he was savvy enough to realise that if someone builds a car, they're always going to want to build install an engine that maybe you hadn't allocated for. So he wanted that chassis to be able to cope with most powers. I think in subsequent years and testing in America, because the chassis or the project went to the US, and subsequent testing on the chassis in America proved that it could actually handle up to 600 brake horsepower. Talking of race cars, there were 2 versions of that available. The RS, which was the entry level, power came from full crossflow 1700. Sorry, I beg your pardon. That one was the top of the range. No, the RS was the entry level with the crossflow 1700 for speed gearbox and fabric doors, or I guess like mohair side screens, I'm guessing, rather than fabric doors. I don't know if that's the right description, but that's what I kind of see them having in my mind. And the RSR, which was the top of the range, which had a Ford Escort spec XR3i CVH engine with twin Weber 40 DCOE carburetors. And I think if you wanted the vegan tune car, I think the vegan tune engine was harder to get when that car was released, so that may be why the RSR had the CVH XR3 spec engine in it. I think I'm not too sure about that. Back to pricing though, but kits were initially priced at a bargain £2,000 for GTA with Chevette power, with full builds from £6,500. Amazing, suicidal value perhaps in 1984. I'm not sure if they realised that they'd made a mistake or what, but within weeks the prices rose 300% to £6,000 for a kit and 13 grand from price for turnkey. But don't forget, you had to add VAT and 23% duty for Irish customers, which that was brutal in terms of the add-ons to the cost of the kit and car. And as I said, there was talk that the Thompson manufacturing company wanted to appeal to young Irish-based customers. There really was plenty of publicity in Ireland for the project pre-launch, but that just didn't materialise. And I think 5 of the 39 sold went off to Canada to another potential agent who talked a big game of 50 cars a year. But I don't think that came to anything. Obviously, it didn't. But the majority of the kits and cars sold were headed for the mainland and England primarily. The Works Racer, raced by a very handy Irish driver called John Kearney, did very well. Proved it won first time out, and it really proved the car's credentials every time it raced, beyond question. I think the duty and the VAT, and a car that was aimed at the Irish domestic market, I think that really killed it, really. And I think the Thompsons realised that, because before they ceased trading in 1987, the Thompson Brothers were casting around for possible alternative manufacturing sites. And I think they'd identified a likely site in Wales, but for whatever reason that didn't happen really. Well, obviously it didn't. Talking about numbers, that 39 figure is one I do believe to be true, although I have seen 26 mentioned as a possible sale, but from what I can understand and what I know, I think 3940 is a much more realistic and correct figure. And this at the time, so the car was withdrawn from sale, but it wasn't dead. It was just there. The Thompson Manufacturing Company carried on for a time, I think, I think they did contract metal work and machining. But then well-known American businessman and entrepreneur, the late Don Panoz, he'd set up a company in Ireland many years before, 1969, a pharmaceutical company called Elan Corporation. Hugely successful, so much so that I think it became the first Irish-based company to be listed, or Irish-located company, owned company to be listed on the US stock market. There's some conjecture now. Don Panos wasn't directly involved, or indirectly even involved with TMC, but his son was. And there's some conjecture as to how his son Dan became involved with TMC. Some reliable sources say that he did work there from 1986, bearing in mind it closed in 1987. Others say that Panoz Jr. Went for a job interview there, but before he was employed or had the chance to be employed, they closed down. I'm not too sure which, but anyway, he was a keen fan of Frank Costin and, of course, the TMC Costin. He had aspirations. I don't think his father did, but certainly Dan Panoz, who's that company, Panoz Motorsport Corporation or something. It still Panoz Motorsports still exists and is very notable still in the States. I don't know if the funding that came from his father was on a reluctant, but he persuaded his dad to help fund the acquisition or fund the setting up of Panoz Motorsports, and of one of his first acquisitions, which was buying the TMC Costin project from the Thompsons, with enough put my teeth in, with enough components to build two cars, I believe. I think they were rolling chassis and the components to finish them off. And he also hired two ex-TMC employees, Sean Thompson and a technician called Mick Murphy. Panoz officially launched in 1989 in the US. Frank's car formed the basis for one of the Panoz models, probably their first model actually, the Panoz Roadster, albeit only in the chassis and suspension, the areas where Frank's expertise really soared. And I recommend Googling Panoz Motorsports. As I said, company still still in existence, run by Dan. They've got huge reach in motorsport. They still build and race their own cars around the world, while also build them for their customers. Don Panoz, I believe, died in 2018. And I imagine that his initial, he was, I think, a little bit unsure about getting involved in motorsport. But I guess by that time it was long gone, such is the success that the company had enjoyed and continued to grow and flourish. They got one time they owned American circuits, Road Atlanta, Sebring International, and what's the one in Canada? Mosport Park in Canada. But I think they sold those and the Panoz Racing School in 2013, I believe, from my memory of reading the Google Wikipedia page. So that must be true, obviously. But they concentrate now on racing and building cars. As far as Frank was concerned, he moved back to the UK, and I think, as ever, he remained sort of pragmatic about the projects he designed that hadn't quite made it. But it was certainly another near miss that should have done a lot better than it did, obviously. There was one more string to Frank's bow before he died, and that was a car called the Costin Roadster. I recommend you Google that. That's a beautiful thing with lots of potential. That was the last car that he worked on, and it was a cracker. But that's it really. So I hope you enjoyed that one. I wanted to keep it below 30 minutes, and I think I've just about managed that. Neil's put some good photos up of the car. Some of those have never been seen before, by the way. And I hope you enjoyed it. So until next time, wherever you are in the world, thanks for giving us a chunk of your time. Much appreciated. And I really look forward to welcoming you to the Total Kit Car YouTube channel again very soon. Thanks for visiting.